if you've ever been conflicted between two different decisions or desires and deeply unsettled because you can't reconcile which one to go with, it is because there is a lack of coherence in your consciousness or identity, or perhaps manifestations in life. And the way this can manifest at the individual level is that you can set a goal to do something, to be something, to achieve something. And you set out on that goal, but when you're met with resistance or you're met with an opposing desire, then all of a sudden you flip the script. And you don't necessarily understand why. You might even beat yourself up because of it. And you might say that it is self-sabotage, and indeed, many people might agree with you. But I have a little bit of a different take, in that when your identity is fully solidified in the new aspiration, the new direction, the new life path that you are trying to go down, then those challenges no longer meet you with the same regard. It no longer has any weight to it. And it is through this process of increasing and gaining coherence in your internal world, your thought patterns, your behavior patterns, your verbal scripts, everything that makes you you. When you actually complete that shift and that change, then the past no longer triggers you in the same way. It no longer holds power over you. And even people who you might have been very, very bonded to, suddenly, especially in the case of needing to walk away out of self-love or self-respect, whereas previously it was very, very challenging, all of a sudden it's like they don't have the ability to penetrate your new force field. And this is the power of coherence. That when you actually shift identities, you gain not only a different perspective on whatever was bothering you or plaguing you, but you gain this new aspect. It's not a new persona because you carry over the you from yesterday. It's not like you just reboot into another character. It doesn't work like that. You edify your personality, but you add another dimension to it. And that other dimension takes up more residence inside you than it ever did before. And that is what gives you the courage, the strength, and the conviction to step into a new existence or a new chapter, or to put down whatever vice you've been struggling with. And until that point, there seems to be this process of, I call it the vacillation effect. I've seen it in myself and others that I help on the personal transformation journey. And there is a process of going back and forth for a period of time. And like a sine wave, if we were to map it out, the new you versus the old you, what we would find is that the amount of time that you spend in the old you versus the new you gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And so the sine wave changes shape. It's not really changing shape, but it changes the amplitude and the frequency depending on where you are shifting into. And from moment to moment, you can be quite hard on yourself, seeing yourself, quote, slide backwards, or to be conflicted again with a particular choice, especially in the presence of desire. You meet somebody and they're like, hey, do you want to go do this vice that you let go of? You're like, maybe. And so that's just an easy example. There are many ways that this can actually play out. But so these, quote, slip-ups for a period of time are more frequent as you are navigating out of one life path and into another. And it is true that some people just cold turkey and move forward. And I would say that these are people that have already done the internal reconciliation process to gain that coherence. Because by the time that they make that decision, they're already set on it. They already have the coherence. And there are many people that actually wait to decide until they have coherence. So it can look like they're taking a long time. It can look like they're lost in analysis paralysis, but they're actually doing the internal reconciliation process to garner that courage and conviction and determination to actually build a new part of their identity out as a dominant function. So the part that desires changes. The part that acts in a certain way changes. The core person doesn't change, but it's the relationship to the desire, the relationship to the choice to pursue that desire or to let it go. That's what changes. And when you have coherence, what you find is that your manifestations become very, very clear. So when people do not have coherence, they might have two situationships that they're going back and forth between. And when they show up at one, they're fully present and fully engaged, and even perhaps planning a life with them and future faking. I call it future faking because the next moment they're with the other situationship and they're fully engaged, and all of a sudden their mind is in a different place. Their heart is in a different place, and they start future faking with the other one. And meanwhile, they go back home and they're confused because they're like, I don't know what I really want. And that's because there's not coherence. So in situations like that, they actually build out two different relationship paths that they go between for a period of time until they make that decision, hopefully, before they enter into a full monogamous committed relationship. They make that decision. Not everybody is conscious, building conscious relationships to that regard. So when they're not, it can be quite messy. So when there's coherence that is lacking, you'll see almost a compartmentalization of the self. That there is a set of desires that one aspect of the self wants. And when another aspect comes out, often in the face of a stimulus, a trigger, or an invitation, then what can happen is that whichever dominant self, whichever dominant fragment is the most dominant, that's the one that will win. And if they have equal dominance, then they will shift in and out of those personality fragments and compartments as the world entices them and as they give in to their desires. So this is why people can get lost in addictions to things like adult films when they're in relationships. They have two competing desires of intimacy, to be with their partner or to be by themselves. And what can happen is that whichever fragment is most dominant can actually take over and run the show. And this creates a lot of deception and lying behavior, potentially, depending on how they deal with it in their lives. And so as a result, the manifestation of the life that they create for themselves is chaotic sometimes, unsatisfactory, confusing for the other people involved. and creates this unavailability. In this particular example, they're pouring their energy into themselves. Meanwhile, their partner is wanting to, presumably, if they haven't already checked out of the partnership. Once they check out of the partnership, then it's a different story. But early on, before the decimation of the intimacy bond, what can happen is that the person that is flying solo can do this and not put that energy into the partnership, which then causes that partnership to erode, to degrade, and to eventually die off entirely. But until that happens, there's this illusion and this growing disappointment because the intimacy of the bond is not actually being nurtured and nourished. And so these two competing desires of wanting to have a healthy, intimate relationship with somebody, but being consumed by a solo relationship with the adult film industry, causes a breakdown in the person's life that if they understood this concept of coherence, they might be better off for it, because they might be sitting from a position of being more aware of understanding what was happening inside of them and what was being played out in the outside world. Because this is a consciousness podcast, and we illuminate the patterns of the human psyche to understand why reality doesn't unfold the way that we want it to. And very often when we are captive to our own desires, what happens is that we lose sight of the fact that we create the circumstances of our lives. And it's normal to fall prey to this type of thinking. I still do, sometimes. Not as much as I used to, but sometimes I do, and I have to catch myself. It seems to be ingrained in most humans. I don't want to say all. I know that there are some of you advanced on the journey that you might have had a different upbringing and story, but for a lot of people, they feel that their circumstances are created for them, not by them. And so they get to the breakup where their partner is walking out, and then they feel victimized. I've had this happen. It's almost a miracle to see, because you're like, we talked about it. Anyway, sorry. So when they feel victimized, that is the time to do the deep inner personal work, to understand they're part of the creation. But unfortunately, when people are hurt, and especially when they are confronting loss, because most people don't like to lose anything, and even if they're not nurturing or treating that connection in the way that would bring it to its highest vibration, its highest manifestation, then they still don't want to let go, and they can still feel victimized by the experience. And when that pain of being hurt is greater than what they can reasonably handle, objectively speaking, it causes something inside of them to break and to not be able to see themselves clearly, and to hyper-focus on the other person and the fact that they walked away in self-love and self-respect. And it takes some time for the pain to dampen, for them to start to self-reflect, to do that examination, and to understand how they co-created that dynamic. So that's how it can play out in a very messy, potentially chaotic way. When people don't have coherence, they are split between different desires because the personality construct within them is split. And at one point, they might have a fragment that's leading their behavior selection protocols. And the next, they have another fragment that's in charge. And when you see a very, very compartmentalized personality, you can pretty much bet that there's some secret lives, secret hobbies, or just a lot of secrets, period, split between different people. There was somebody famous recently who was, I don't remember his name, Andrew something. It came out, he was a leader in a spiritual community, meditation community, and it came out that in addition to his wife, he had, I don't know how many girlfriends. This is a great example of that. That when somebody is highly, highly compartmentalized, and I've seen it play out in people that I've worked with and people that I know personally, you will actually fulfill the desires of one particular compartment with one particular person. And if you are ashamed of those desires, then very often you will keep that person secret. That's the truth. That you actually keep those desires tied to that person or the series of people secret. And that's why people can be married and have a dozen different girlfriends and nobody knows about each other. Because deep down, they're each fulfilling a role of a personality compartment because there's not coherence in the individual's psyche. And as a result, their outside world is fractured. If we were to look at it from a higher lens of examination, we would see that the way that they split their energy into their different hobbies and people and interest is very, very fractured as a result. And so a lot of pain actually comes from not having coherence and not understanding who's driving the avatar. The avatar has sometimes more than one driver. And if you are on the receiving end of somebody like this, then you might not understand why you're blindsided when the blindside comes. Because you might not understand that the person that you've been working with or in a relationship with or partnered with in a business setting has multiple drivers in them. And when they are not in your presence, they might have somebody else driving their avatar. So when you understand the concept of coherence, you understand why you see a lot of dysfunction, heartbreak, and pain in our world, and why sometimes people don't make sense, and why at other times you are surprised by your own behavior and decision making, especially when you're caught between a rock and a hard place, or you are insistent on giving up a vice, and all of a sudden under the right conditions you're right back in the vice, whatever that is. So the best way to gain coherence is to actually recognize how many drivers you have. And I like to, when I do client work, I like to actually work with the different drivers. A lot of people will try to shy away from continuing our work whenever they have somebody driving that they're ashamed of. And I actually prefer to let those voices be heard too, where we can go through a process of integration, because very often, and not all the time, it can relate to a fractured personality that is afraid of being seen and loved, and so it lives in shame. And when we allow it to speak, we allow it to journal, we allow it to talk, we learn things, sometimes related to the person's upbringing or history. And this is the disenfranchised self, the neglected self, the abandoned self, that sometimes has their own music interest and book interest and movie interest and TV series. And so when you love the different fragments, you see the different fragments, you bring them into the party, and then you set boundaries around them. You integrate them into the whole through that self-compassion and that self-acceptance. But you have them work with the whole so they're not dominating for a period of time and potentially ruining somebody's life. You put limits and boundaries around them. You give them ways to express or to transmute whatever their particular cravings or inclinations are. And you pull it into a reasonable level. So you're not spending all of your money on whatever it is and tanking your budget for the month if you have a budget. Not everybody does. Or going on a compulsive shopping spree. There are so many ways it can manifest. And so when you invite it to the party and you let it speak, especially if you can have yourself make art during that process, during that conversation, what happens is a beautiful alchemization, leading you ultimately to self-acceptance and allowing yourself to shift into that sine wave, ultimately getting into more coherence